Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. Well, I'm back to rocks again. I'm continuing the exploration of whether non-human things, such as animals, plants, and rocks, might be conscious in some way. And now, after several episodes drawing from major religious sources and quantum physics, I am turning to philosophy. Which is like saying I'm in a rowboat heading across the Atlantic. There is some exaggeration there, but philosophy does feel like an ocean. And to get across it, I know I need a way to focus or to chart the course. So I'm back to rocks as a starting point. Rocks are like a symbol for all the types of things we find it hardest to imagine might be conscious. I suppose most of us will sympathize with the words of this geologist who is quoted in an article I've cited previously from a 2023 piece in The Guardian. And here's the quote. As a geologist, no, rocks are not conscious. They are not aware of their being, nor do they make conscious decisions. Seems obvious, common sense. I'll leave aside for a moment the implicit but untested definition of consciousness that's embedded in that conclusion. In other words, that consciousness means being aware of one's existence and making conscious decisions. I want to jump instead to something said by that same geologist just a bit later. But also as a geologist who has spent a long time working on granite, there is something special about granite. The granites define a certain type of landscape and therefore a character of place. They come with their myths and legends and are said to whistle different ways in certain weathers. Generations of artists and writers have been inspired by granites. Could rocks be conscious? Maybe. So the geologist is a beautiful example of how different ways of knowing are important in our human experience. The science told that geologist no, while their imaginative and artistic senses said maybe. And that's really a point that I've been trying to make throughout the podcast, that we have different ways of knowing. So my exploration of religions and physics thus far, and now my incorporation of art, are really different ways of knowing. And art is a way of knowing that we refer to as imagination. Now, how does this all help me focus as I launch myself into the philosophy ocean in my little rowboat? Or to switch metaphors, I guess I need some guide rails. My first guide rail is to focus, for now at least, on things that are generally considered to lack consciousness, and that's why I keep coming back to rocks. Later, I'll come back to see how what I discover may have implications for how I understand consciousness relative to more complex things and beings like human beings. Second, I'm focusing my attention on what philosophy might say about the ways that I've described different dimensions of consciousness. In the course of the last episodes, I've considered a number of different definitions of consciousness, ranging from it's just an illusion, a meaningless function of matter, to it's everything we experience physically, emotionally, mentally. And in between those extremes are the definitions I've noted above related to decision-making and problem-solving and self-awareness, etc. in prior episodes. But I did not adopt any of those definitions, and I didn't try to make my own definition. I've taken a descriptive approach in which I include two rather general elements of consciousness, experience and awareness. I see those potentially exhibited in different ways, and so as a result, I developed a multi-dimensional approach, which you're aware of if you've listened to prior episodes. It specifically has 4 dimensions. One-dimensional consciousness, in which a subject, quote-unquote, in this case, a thing like a rock, experiences what happens in some way, but is not aware of experiencing it. And so as I put it in a prior episode, whether the rock feels anything or not when being crushed, it does experience it. The crushing happens. The rock is crushed. That's an experience. Two-dimensional is the situation in which a subject experiences what happens to it and is aware of experiencing it. Are rocks aware? Three-dimensional. A subject experiences what happens, is aware of experiencing that, and is aware of being aware. And then the multidimensional, which is my fourth dimension. A subject experiences all of the above themselves, first person, but also in the first person, we might say, they experience all of that as do other subjects. In other words, as if they are first person, they are experiencing what all the other subjects are also experiencing and being aware of being aware. Now, that's beyond the level of things or even humans, I presume. So my third guardrail or guide rail is really a point of comparison that I'm going to employ. I want to see what philosophers might say about a tentative conclusion that I came to after exploring the ways that religious heritages and quantum physics inform the conversation about consciousness. And here's my most concise version of that conclusion. If consciousness and reality are entangled, then it follows, for me at least, that everything in the cosmos might be conscious, or that at the very least, if the things in the universe are not conscious themselves, they are at least deeply connected with consciousness in ways that affect how they behave at the level of their subatomic particles, among other things. So, 3 guide rails. Focus on the things we probably assume are least likely to be conscious. Use my descriptive approach, employing the concepts of experience and awareness, and test my working conclusion about the cosmos and consciousness. So, rocks. Do they experience anything? Are they aware of that? Are they connected in any way to consciousness? Now, of course, not all philosophers are interested in what rocks have to say about this or what rocks might think about it all, but I am. So I begin to row my boat into the ocean and start with the field within philosophy, generally referred to as the philosophy of mind. The philosophy of mind covers all sorts of philosophical topics pertaining to the mind and mental states. Its subtopics are all little oceans of their own. Rationality, mental states, emotions, logic, and more all fall under this umbrella. Consciousness is just one of those subtopics. Where does consciousness come from? What is it? What things possess it are all related topics in philosophical reflection on consciousness. It's no surprise that the number of theories put forward to explain consciousness are actually difficult to keep track of. There's so many of them, and they subdivide and they gather complexity as they develop. Just to name a few of the larger tribes within the philosophy of mind, nation, if you will. So philosophy of mind as a nation, and then in there's tribes. Dualism, eliminativism, illusionism, idealism, phenomenalism, monism, and the list goes on. Instead of looking at each one of those theories separately, which would be an all-encompassing task for multitudes of episodes, I'm going to try to boil things down to what I would call approaches, starting points that really kind of might apply in any of those tribes, so to speak. They're sort of like working hypotheses or ways of seeing. Given the way that philosophical reflection works, both with individual philosophers and within the philosophical tribes themselves, there's a circular nature to the relationship between hypotheses and conclusions, ways of seeing, and then coming back to determine how those things end up. A starting point might initiate a journey that gets shaped by questions and challenges to those questions, and then new insights, and then a return to the starting point. And the return is always accompanied by a fresh set of insights and modifications, and so new questions, which become, in fact, a new starting point, and so on. So, be that as it may, here's 3 major starting points, 3 ways of seeing, which I see in the philosophical world, 3 sorts of sets of assumptions about consciousness. The first of those is functionalism. Functionalism approaches the question of consciousness with the assumption that the important thing is not what it is. We might not even be able to know what consciousness is. nor where it is. In other words, what has it. What's important with consciousness is to understand how it works, to just describe that, what it does, how it functions, in other words, hence functionalism. So mental states are not to be explained by their intrinsic makeup or what they are, but by their relationships with what we might call inputs and outputs, where inputs might be sensory stimuli, for example, or, to use my terminology, experiences. And outputs might be the subsequent behaviors we engage in or things engage in, or changes, perhaps to other mental states. What matters again is not why or from where or even what consciousness consists of, but what matters is what it does. What does that thing we call consciousness do? So again, its function and hence functionalism. Then there's what I would call reductionism, and I'll slash materialism onto this. And first, just to be clear, that word materialism isn't about consumerism or being materialistic. In this case, materialism is used in the sense that matter is all that there is. The material of the world, in other words, is all that there is. And this is the position relative to consciousness, which equates all mental activity with brain activity. Meaning, anything we might associate with consciousness is just equivalent to and identical with brain states or events or processes. To put it another way, we can boil every thought process, every emotion, all awareness of things and of self down into the mechanical parts, so to speak, of the electrochemical processes of the physical brain. That's all they are. They're one and the same. It's not that the chemical processes create consciousness. That is consciousness. So functionalism and this thing I've called reductionism are not mutually exclusive, of course. Functionalism may simply be describing how that material, biological set of assumptions about consciousness actually works, for example. But there is another approach that I want to look at, and that's a somewhat controversial one, panpsychism. Panpsychism, and by the way, that's a word which comes from the Greek words pan, or all, and psyche, meaning soul. It's just the view that all things, not just human beings or human mental states, are conscious, or at least associated with consciousness. A revised version of the theory, pan-proto-psychism, suggests that everything is at least proto-conscious, or pre-conscious, if you will, potentially conscious, maybe, not currently exhibiting consciousness, perhaps, in any form that we might understand it. Given that the third of my three guardrails was the working conclusion about consciousness and the cosmos drawn from physics and religion, it seems like spending my time with panpsychism is called for. Among all the different approaches in philosophy, this is the one that probably, whether it's true or not, has the most overlap with the view of consciousness I've gleaned from my survey of religions and quantum physics. So I'm going to talk about rocks and panpsychism, I guess. Now, panpsychism very consciously developed in conversation with quantum science. That's another reason that I want to converse with it here, which, as we've seen, describes the subatomic particle layer of reality as behaving as if it were conscious. Functionalists would feel at home here. Reductionist forms of materialism probably less so. In dialogue with quantum physics, panpsychism proposes that all things have mind-like qualities. Beyond the brief definition above, what else can we say? It's important to note that there are a variety of forms of this theory of panpsychism. So we're not talking about one monolithic set of concepts. However, we can summarize some of the more important ideas in the theory of panpsychism, and I'm going to name three. Namely, that consciousness is, one, universal, meaning that everything, every aspect of the cosmos exhibits something like sentience, what we might call mind-like symptoms, subjective experience of some sort, and thus consciousness. Consciousness is, two, ontological, and this is something that functionalism and materialism or reductionism both would reject. The ontological nature of consciousness is that it that it is. That's what ontology talks about. It's a study of the things that are. It's a fundamental reality in its own right, consciousness is, not explicable by being dependent upon something else to exist, like a warm brain that has electrochemical functions. Now, the relationship between consciousness and a warm brain or some other mechanism by which consciousness happens is complicated. But panpsychism would suggest that consciousness has its own existence. And third, consciousness is varied. There are levels or degrees of consciousness, levels of complexity, different types of sentience or mentality, mind examples, mind exhibits, you might say. Thus, while human and animal consciousness, for example, might be more complex or higher than that of plants and rocks, those higher, more complex examples are grounded in more fundamental kinds of consciousness that might also be found in plants and rocks. Put another way, the type of mentality we know through our own experience is present in some form in a wide range of natural bodies or things. So as a result, panpsychism posits that there is more consciousness in the universe than might be commonly thought. Including rocks? It's been convenient for me to use rocks as an example. We all know what a rock is. That's one reason it's convenient. Most of us would not associate rocks with consciousness. Not automatically, not without a lot of the kind of thinking we've been doing in this series. But at this point, I want to get a little bit more precise than I have so far about rocks. And panpsychism helps me to do that. Panpsychism makes the case that sentience, or subjective experience, is universal at least at a primitive, basic, fundamental level, including subatomic particles. However, it does not necessarily ascribe consciousness to all aggregate things. That is, it doesn't ascribe consciousness necessarily to all the things that those particles combine to make. So, for example, rocks. Making the distinction between the possible consciousness of rocks as an aggregate versus that of the particles that combine to make the rock is one level of precision that's important to note. Another level of precision, panpsychism suggests, is in making a distinction between pan-experientialism and pan-cognitivism. Put in a simplistic way, it's the difference between everything experiences something in some way and everything thinks or is aware. Hence, my categories of experience and awareness come into play here. Proponents of panpsychism do not necessarily believe that particles themselves have complex cognitive functions, thinking functions, we might say, such as beliefs, desires, fears, emotions, etc. Using, the vocabulary of my model, not everything has awareness, but everything experiences. And at the particle level, everything behaves then as if conscious. The nature of that consciousness and its connection potentially to higher or more complex forms of consciousness remains mysterious. Which leads me to introduce another form of panpsychism called cosmopsychism. The type of panpsychism I've so far discussed might be called micro-panpsychism. Bear with me a little bit here. These are my own, I'm coining my own phrases here. But I use that term micro-panpsychism because it holds that consciousness is real at the most minute subatomic particle level. Cosmopsychism, however, hypothesizes that the cosmos as a whole is the fundamental level of reality, and that consciousness is grounded in that cosmic whole, not in the subatomic particles. All other types of consciousness, including human consciousness or rock consciousness, derive from the larger cosmic consciousness or are expressions of it somehow. So we could say that for cosmopsychism, consciousness begins at the macro, cosmic, big, vast level, and then the micro levels are a result of that. Whereas for other theories of panpsychism, The process flows in the other direction, from the micro subatomic particle to recombinations up to the macro, more complex expressions of consciousness. Whether rooted in the microparticle or the cosmic, so far this philosophical trek has led to a view of reality that is full of or fully connected with consciousness in some way. And rather than leaving this as a conceptual framework, I want to receive it for now as an invitation at this point, an invitation to step in and experience the interconnected, entangled reality that I share with all things. To respond to that invitation, I'm going to pause here and present a song that I've shared before. And sometimes I hesitate to repeat things too many times in these episodes, but repetition is not necessarily a bad thing. We see new things every time we experience something. We're at a different place in our own life every time we hear one of the songs that I might present, for example. I also know that there are people for whom this is the first episode. And so for them, it's not a repetition. But be that as it may, here it is, the song Elemental Spirits. I'm gonna step onto the earth, gonna sink my feet deep in. I'm gonna let it bury all of me, let it soak into my skin. I'm in the earth, and the earth is in me. Elemental spirits, elemental spirits. I'm gonna step into the wind, open wide and breathe it in. I'm gonna feel it wrap around me, let it soak into my skin. I'm in the wind, and the wind is in me. Elemental spirits, elemental spirits. I'm gonna go down to the water, I'm gonna walk right in, sink down to the tall around me, let it soak into my skin. I'm in the water is in me. Elemental spirits, elemental spirits. I'm gonna reach out for the fire, I'm gonna stick my hands right in, let the heat and burn surround me, let it soak into my skin. I'm in the fire, and the fire is in me. Elemental spirits, elemental spirits, elemental spirits, elemental spirits. Now, before moving forward, I want to put a question on the table. Okay, we've been talking about panpsychism as a theory, but is it true? I've explained it, but what about critiques of the theory? And here's a summary of some of the major criticisms that I've come across. First, it's absurd. I mean, for many, it just seems that common sense tells us that it's absurd to attribute consciousness to inanimate objects. The idea that rocks might have any kind of consciousness, even a minimal level, is just counterintuitive. A second criticism that I've come across is that it's not testable, it's not verifiable. So some argue that since we can't empirically verify or falsify the claim that all matter possesses consciousness of some sort, we shouldn't embrace the theory. Now, let me first respond to both of those objections, and then I have two more to bring up. I'm not sure how all proponents of panpsychism might argue, but in my view, quantum physics provides plenty of evidence that the universe is in fact counterintuitive, even for a lot of us absurd, when we compare that with our typical common sense notions of how things work. I won't repeat everything we've looked at in prior episodes, but there's plenty of things that quantum physics tells us based on testing and theoretical physics that just runs counter to our daily experience. So while panpsychism itself is not testable, it is a theory that emerged in large part due to the sort of testing and theorizing of quantum physicists. I see it as an extension of quantum physics' way of seeing the world. So it's not testable, and it seems absurd, but it seems to be in keeping with what quantum physics tells us. There are two more critiques, however, and both are similar to each other in that they criticize, both of them, panpsychism based on whether it can adequately explain other mysteries related to consciousness. First, what's called the combination problem. This critique begins from the premise of quantum physics that even subatomic particles exhibit behaviors we associate with consciousness. But this critique asks, well, if they're conscious at these subatomic simple levels, how do these minimal forms of consciousness combine to form the complex types of consciousness we experience as humans? And panpsychism does not, in their view, offer a cohesive explanation for that combination problem. Next, a causation problem. The first objection focused on the difficulties of explaining how combinations happen. This second one is related to the question of how to explain the cause of consciousness. The material explanation for consciousness is that consciousness results from electrical chemical processes of the brain. Causation is explicable in that way. But critics of panpsychism say that the theory can't explain a non-material causation for any type of consciousness. And so, therefore, they would say the theory isn't true, or at least can't be proven. Now, these are important criticisms, and they raise important questions. Do they disprove the theory? There's a similar conundrum relative to theories of quantum physics. We can describe what particles do in, for example, the double slit experiment, but we can't explain why. That doesn't mean that they don't behave the way they do. And so if panpsychism does not provide an adequate account for combination and causation, that does not necessarily disprove the theory. But it does leave us with very important questions about consciousness. For example, where does consciousness come from if it is not caused by matter in some way or other things that we can identify? And how do microparticles seem to combine to form more and complex forms of consciousness? Or do they combine to do that? The questions that critics ask of panpsychism do not disprove it, but the questions panpsychism can't answer begin to pull us inexorably, like a tractor beam in Star Wars, to consider whether there is some form of big C consciousness as well as small c consciousness. In other words, the conversation about rocks will lead very naturally, indeed necessarily, to questions about the divine. But in my own descriptive four-dimensional model, that question about the divine is a leap probably to the fourth dimension, the multi-dimension level. So I need to look first at human consciousness. And so, as tempting as it might be to jump right back to religion and the divine, I'm going to press forward. And I'm going to begin to bring a conclusion to this episode. I gave myself 3 guide rails as I started this conversation about philosophy. First was to focus on things we probably assume are least likely to be conscious. Second, use my descriptive approach employing the concepts of experience and awareness. And then finally, test my working conclusions about the cosmos and consciousness in light of the philosophical conversations. So I've tried to do that. I've stayed focused on rocks as best I could. I have at times pulled back to talk about experience and awareness. But how does that working conclusion hold up? The one formed following the episodes where I explored religion and physics. Here it is again. If consciousness and reality are entangled, then it follows, for me at least, that everything in the cosmos might be conscious. Or that at the very least, if the things in the universe are not conscious themselves, they are at least deeply connected with consciousness in ways that affect how they behave at the level of their subatomic particles. The excursion into the ocean of philosophy, which I've undertaken in my little rowboat, has not yet resulted in any winds or storms or currents that would cause my boat's course to veer away from the destination that conclusion which I brought here to the journey that I'm taking from religion and physics is charting. It's not taking me away from that destination. It hasn't steered me off course. Religions and physics and now philosophy in different ways and with different nuances and different questions are all adding actually to what has brought me to that conclusion. Namely, even more simply put, that the cosmos is more full of consciousness than we might normally imagine. After all these attempts to give an explanation of that conclusion, I'm going to end with a song that, again, I've shared before, that is an attempt to create a musical experience of it. It's my song, Song of Light.
Light is falling into my window as light as feather in my hands. Light a moon is lace on cinders, tongues of light in woven strands. Light is falling. Light is falling. Light is flowing out through my window as light as feathered wing flies from hand. Light on the moon, night sky is cinder. Light from tongues like flowing strands. Light is flowing. Light is flowing. Light is glowing. Light is my window. Light is feathered nesting in my hand. Light is moon and night and cinder. Light is words on tongues, glowing strands. Light is glowing. Light is glowing. Night is falling into my window, as light as feather in my hands. Light of moon is lace on cinders. Tongues of light fall in woven strands. Light is flowing out through my window, as light as feathered wing flies from hand. Light on the moon, night sky is cinder. Light from tongues like flowing strands. Light is glowing, light is my window. Light is feathered bird nesting in my hand. Light is moon and night and cinder. Light is words on tongues, glowing strands.
I plan to hold on to the way of framing things that I've given here, this definition or this conclusion that the cosmos is more full of consciousness than we may imagine, and that things, even if they're not conscious themselves, are at least deeply connected with consciousness. I'm going to hang on to all of that as I get ready for the future. But I'm going to set aside some of the thinking about rocks and subatomic particles for a moment and turn to the much more complicated question of human beings and human consciousness. So, until next time.